Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. We're going to start out tonight with Clive Cussler, who died recently at the age of 88. Clive Cussler was an American adventure novelist and underwater explorer, very important in marine salvage in Charleston, South Carolina. Here's Charleston TV to report his death.
Famed author Clive Cussler has passed away. Cussler is credited with finding the H.L. Hunley Confederate submarine off the coast of Charleston. Cussler and his dive team discovered the Hunley back on May 3, 1995. The author also wrote more than 24 novels like Sahara and Raise the Titanic. Clive Cussler was 88 years old.
Clive Cussler wasn't just any novelist. He sold over 50 million books, and his novels reached the New York Times fiction bestseller list more than 20 times. Here's a news report telling a little bit more about Clive Cussler. Best-selling novelist Clive Cussler, who wrote more than 85 books and sold more than 100 million copies, died recently at his home in Scottsdale, Arizona at the age of 88. Cussler created the popular Dirk Pitt character for many of his novels, taking his name from the author's son, the Arizona Republic reported. In addition, Cussler discovered more than 60 shipwreck sites, the newspaper reported. His novels kept readers entranced with tales of suspense. He wrote about Mayan jungles, ghost ships, underwater kingdoms, beautiful women, and heroes modeled after himself for more than 4 decades, according to the newspaper. His books were translated into 40 languages and cracked the New York Times bestseller list more than 20 times. He amassed an estimated $80 million during his career. Cussler was born in Aurora, Illinois in 1931 and grew up in Alhambra, California. After serving in the U.S. Air Force, he worked in advertising as a copywriter and as a creative director. Cussler's first big novel was Raise the Titanic, which was published in 1976. It was made into a movie like many of his books. Other books of note included Valhalla Rising in 2001 and The Sea Hunters, published in 1996. Cussler created the National Underwater and Marine Agency as a fictional government organization that employed Dirk Pitt, but it became a real agency in 1979, a nonprofit group committed to preserving maritime heritage through the discovery, archaeologic survey, and conservation of shipwreck artifacts. Well, the only other thing I can tell you is that I saw the movie Raise the Titanic. It starred Richard Jordan as Dirk Pitt, and he was one of my favorite actors. Watch him in The Friends of Eddie Coyle if you can. I was actually going to work with him on The Fugitive, but he died a few months into the filming and I never got to meet him. Raise the Titanic wasn't a great movie. They were going to have a Dirk Pitt series of movies like Indiana Jones, but the movie lost a whole bunch of money. In fact, I think it cost more to make the movie than it cost to raise the actual Titanic. All that notwithstanding, Clive Cussler was an amazingly talented guy. We're going to move on now to Johnny Antonelli, who died recently at the age of 89. He was a pitcher primarily for the New York Giants, and in the mid-50s he was one of the top pitchers in the National League. In 1954, he was the Giants' best pitcher, and that was the year that the Giants upset the Cleveland Indians in the 1954 World Series, and Johnny Antonelli had a lot to do with it. The Indians had won 111 games during the regular season, which at the time was the record for regular season victories, and they were heavy favorites in the World Series. They came into New York to the Polo Grounds, and basically the Giants just smoked them, and then they beat them in Cleveland as well. So it was a 4-game sweep. Johnny Antonelli threw a complete game victory in Game 2 and pitched the final 2 innings in relief in Game 4 to nail down the victory. Here's the call, and it's by Jack Brickhouse, Chicago's very own. You'll notice some familiar names here. Dale Mitchell, who hit the pop-up, was the same guy who struck out 2 years later as the final out in Don Larsen's perfect game. We covered that recently in our Don Larsen podcast, and you hear a brief reference to Al Lopez and Leo DeRocher as well.
Lopez sends up another pinch hitter, Dale Mitchell, and he fouls to Thompson to give the Giants the game 7-4 and the series by a stunning 4-game sweep. In smothering any ideas of a late Indian uprising, Antonelli fanned 3 of the last 6 batters and didn't allow a ball to be hit out of the infield. It's a triumphant moment for Horace Stoneham, president of these world champions of 1954. And it's a crowning achievement to Antonelli's greatest big league season. In the clubhouse, bedlam breaks loose as television crews, photographers, and newspapermen endeavor to record the scene. The overall spirit, aggressiveness, and resourcefulness of the team plus the superb leadership of Leo DeRocher, brought the World Championship to the New York Giants.
Antonelli was one of the first bonus babies in baseball. He was probably the greatest athlete to ever come out of Rochester, New York. Boston Braves paid the equivalent of $500,000 for him, and then he was traded to the Giants, and he thrived in the Polo Grounds with these huge outfields. He let the batters hit it. He wasn't pitching in Game 1, but the World Series may have turned on the famous catch by Willie Mays in deep center field that year, but that's what Antonelli would do. He'd throw that fastball up there and let them hit it and let Willie Mays go chase it. Willie Mays was a young player then. He was one of the first black players in baseball, and other teams used to throw at him. They used to test the mettle of black players. Well, the rule was if you throw at a guy like Willie Mays, who Red Smith said had the Giants eating strawberries in the wintertime, we're going to throw at you guys. And Johnny Antonelli was one of the main enforcers. Here he talks about a 1955 game against the Cincinnati Reds.
One instance that I can remember very well is the Cincinnati Reds had come into the Polo Grounds, and Bertie Tebbetts was their manager. He was an ex-catcher for the Red Sox, and he believed that if you knocked Mays down the first time up, he shied away. So before the series began, we always had a meeting on how we were going to pitch to these different players so everybody knew what to expect. But anyway, Horace Stoneham called Leo DeRocher. He said, you guys better start taking care of his boy, meaning retaliate. Well, he didn't have to tell us that, but that's what he did to Leo. So I'm pitching that day. So the first guy I hit right in the middle of the back. The next guy I hit in the arm. The next guy was Pet Klazuski. He was big. He was so big they had to cut his sleeves off his shirt so he could get his arms in. He was 6'4" and about 280 pounds. I called the catcher out. I think it was Wes Westrom at this time. I said, Wes, if you think I'm going to hit this guy, you're out of your mind. So we laughed, and then he went back behind the plate. 16 innings later, I'm still pitching, and I beat him 2-1. Now, that's not the whole story. The whole story is Mays was never thrown at that game, but I know he was looking for it on every pitch. So it didn't do him any good.
Antonelli went 21-7 in that World Series year. He was third in the MVP voting, and he basically won the equivalent of the Cy Young Award. They didn't have one then. And he was a 5-time All-Star in the mid and late 50s. Again, one of the best pitchers in the National League. The problem was that the Giants moved from New York to San Francisco, and they moved to a small stadium, Seal Stadium, which is where Joe DiMaggio played when he was in the minor leagues. He had a couple of pretty good years in San Francisco, still an all-star for a couple of them. And then all of a sudden he just sort of lost it. Maybe his fastball lost a couple of miles per hour. I'm sure the small dimensions of Seal Stadium and that wind blowing out didn't help him at all. But for whatever reason, around 1960, he just wasn't a very good pitcher anymore. He was traded from the Giants to the American League. I think I have his baseball card when he was with the Indians in 1961. Here he is with a great perspective on the Dodgers and the Giants moving to the West Coast in the late 1950s.
The history of America can be seen through the eyes of baseball. Go West, young man, wasn't just a phrase related to the western expansion of the United States, but a value that held true for entrepreneurs and the development of modern baseball as well. The Dodgers moved out west from New York in the late 1950s. This required changes to the schedule, additional night games, and transit concerns. First-class travel and accommodations had to become the norm in professional sports and everyday life. Six-time All-Star pitcher for the Braves and Giants, Johnny Antonelli, details how getting from one city to the next on the train in the late 40s and 50s changed to the air travel we know today, thus allowing American life to grow as well.
I thought it difficult because, and I wasn't that bad. I was 6'1" in those days. I'm now about 5'11" and 3/4. But some of our players were taller. Now, they had to sleep corner to corner, and of course you heard every da-dum, da-dum, da-dum when the train was going, and I don't think we ever got much sleep. Yeah, that was it. But we enjoyed it because we had our own dining car, and the food was always very good. We went first class in that respect. In 1953, we were the first team to fly. We flew from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh on a Viscount Capital Airlines plane, and everyone was scared to death. We're on an airplane, the whole team on the airplane. So we did that, and that was the first flight. And then, of course, when the West Coast came into it, we had to fly. Sal Magley didn't fly on the East Coast, but he would fly. He Davy Williams and Whitey Lockman. None of them liked to fly, but they had to fly to the West Coast. We only had 600,000 attendees in those days, and the people were all still standing there and wondering why we were leaving, but if they had come to the ballpark, we wouldn't have had to leave. And of course, Horace Throne, that was his income. I mean, he was not a multi-millionaire like we have today or billionaire. Baseball was his life. And Fred Sy was the same way with the Cardinals. He was looking for money, so I was told that the Dodgers went first. You know, they left, and Walter O'Malley called Horace, this is what I was told, and said, we could still have our rivalry. You go to San Francisco, and I'll go to Los Angeles, and the rest is history. Well, I loved the city. I didn't know much about the weather, and we got into Seal Stadium, and that's where Joe DiMaggio made all of it. I think he had 70-some-odd straight games one time. And there was some history here that we knew. And we were leaving, of course, New York, and I liked New York only because I was so lucky there. We knew about San Francisco. It's a beautiful city, and we really liked it. And it looked like we were going to do well. But, of course, with a 23,000-seat ballpark, you knew you weren't going to go crazy, but we still drew over 1 million people, 1.2 million, I think, which was very, very good. And we had a pretty good ball club in those days, and should have won the pennant that year. And unfortunately, we didn't.
Well, we're going to close tonight with Margot Grunfeld Shafran, who died recently at the age of 96. She was an only child growing up in an extended Jewish family in Berlin in the 1920s and 30s. And in 1938, her father, a Polish citizen, was seized and deported to the Polish border, where he languished for 9 months until his wife arranged for 3 sets of papers and passage to Shanghai, China on a half-freighter called the Suwa Maro. They arrived in the Japanese-controlled district of Hankou in August 1939. They lived in barracks ironically called the Heim, contending with rampant disease, starvation, cramped quarters, poor sanitation, and daily bombings. This home became known as the Shanghai ghetto, where 20,000 European Jews felt fortunate enough to escape a far worse fate at the hands of the Nazis. As a young woman, Margot found a way to support herself and her parents, working for a Japanese dentist, and eventually the family was able to move to a little dwelling on a Chinese lane. In August 1945, when Japan lost the war and Emperor Hirohito capitulated, Margot found work in an American PX. There she met a dashing Jewish U.S. serviceman named Richard Dick Shafran. Immediately smitten, they married 6 weeks later in the Ohel Moshe Synagogue in Shanghai in March of 1946. The newlyweds embarked for Poughkeepsie, New York, where they were to begin their new lives. There they joined the Shafran family business, the Rocket Appliance Stores. Margot's altruism, along with Dick's generous support, provided affidavits for numerous extended family members to establish themselves on U.S. shores after World War II. They created and maintained a safety net for so many. Margot and Dick worked hard and were proud parents to their adored children, Ronald and Ayin. They enjoyed 67 years of marriage and the pleasures of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That story was told to me by my friend Giselle, whose parents also survived the Holocaust in China during the Japanese occupation during World War II. Margot was her cousin, and she and her husband helped Giselle's family get to the United States after the war. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. Margot Grunfeld Shafran's story is an ever-present reminder that resilience, resourcefulness, loyalty, and even joy are possible in the face of desperation and fear of the unknown, and that can and ultimately does triumph over evil, and that love conquers all. As a final tribute to Margot Grunfeld Shafran, I'm going to play the favorite song of her and her husband, the song that captured and fueled their optimism during the war and afterwards. It's Irving Berlin, it's Blue Skies, and I'm going to play what I think is the best version by Judy Garland, and she's actually talking to Irving Berlin on a radio show.
One of the first tunes I ever learned to carry was one of yours, and this is it. Blue skies smiling at me, nothing but blue skies do I see. Bluebirds singing a song, nothing but bluebirds all day long.